The ion storm came without warning. One moment Caleb Monroe was watching the stars streak past his cockpit window, calm and quiet as he always liked them. The next, the entire ship shook like something had grabbed it and decided to shake the life out of it. Alarms lit up the console. The engine output dropped to almost nothing. And then the planet below, green and strange and very large, rushed up to meet him far too fast. He pulled the controls hard. The crash was still bad, but it was the kind of bad that left a man breathing instead of the other kind. The ship carved a long ugly scar through a dense forest before it stopped against a wall of stone. Steam rose from the hull. A few fires started, then died in the wet air. Caleb sat in the seat for a long moment, both hands still on the controls, and breathed. Then he unbuckled, checked himself over, found a cut on his forehead and a bruise along his ribs that was going to get worse before it got better, and climbed out of the wreck to take stock of what was left. The answer was, not much. The engine was gone. The long-range radio was a pile of melted parts. The emergency beacon was sending a signal, but weak and broken, more of a whisper than a shout. He had his pack, his blade, his handheld recorder, a week of food if he stretched it, and a survival kit that any wilderness trainer worth his certification would have been pleased with. He had been a wilderness survival trainer, once, back when his life had included things like a regular address and people who called to check on him. That felt like a long time ago. He made camp near the ship and spent the first night listening to the sounds of the planet. It was strange and loud in the way that living places were, full of calls and rustles and things moving through the dark. None of it sounded immediately dangerous. He slept in short stretches and woke each time feeling the particular kind of lonely that comes from being very far away from anyone who knows your name. The second day, he explored in a wide circle around the crash site, mapping the terrain in his recorder and looking for fresh water. He found a river about a kilometer north. He also found tracks in the soft ground near the riverbank, large ones, with claw marks, and he noted them without alarm. Large animals meant large prey, which meant a working ecosystem, which was good news for survival. He followed the river east until the land got rocky and started climbing. That was where he found the ravine. It was narrow and deep, cut into the stone like an old wound. He almost passed it entirely. What stopped him was a sound, faint and high-pitched, coming from somewhere below the lip of the rock. He lay flat on the ground and looked over the edge. The cave was at the base of the ravine, half hidden behind a shelf of stone. And in the cave, huddled together in a pile that looked like it had not moved in some time, were 5 small creatures he had never seen before in any training manual or contact briefing. They were dragons. Or close enough to dragons that his brain went straight to that word and stayed there. They were small, roughly the size of large dogs, covered in scales that caught the light differently depending on the angle. One was red, bright and vivid. One was blue, pale and almost silver. One was green, the shade of deep forest. One was black, so dark it seemed to pull the shadows around it. And one was gray, soft and uneven, slightly larger than the others and currently lying half across the others like a blanket that had given up. They were cold. He could see the shivering even from up on the ridge. And they were hungry. He could tell from the way they were pressed together, conserving what warmth they had. There was no adult nearby. No signs of one. The cave around them had the particular stillness of somewhere that had been waiting too long. Caleb looked at them for a full minute. Then he climbed down. He did it slowly and carefully, making just enough sound that they could hear him coming without being startled. When he reached the base of the ravine and turned toward the cave, the red one was already on its feet, scales bristling, making a sound somewhere between a hiss and a very determined squeak. The others were up behind it a moment later, pressed into a cluster, watching him with eyes that were far too alert for creatures that looked that young. Caleb stopped. He lowered himself to one knee, then to both, then sat cross-legged on the ground with his hands open on his thighs. He looked at a point just to the left of the red one's head, not at its eyes. He waited. The red one kept hissing. The blue one watched him with its head tilted like it was trying to solve a problem. The green one crept sideways along the cave wall, and the black one stayed perfectly still, large eyes fixed on him with an expression he could not read. The gray one, who was at the back, stumbled forward over the green one's tail trying to get a better look, crashed into the red one's side, and sent them both tumbling. The hissing stopped. The gray one sat up, looked at Caleb, looked at the red one, and made a small noise that sounded embarrassed. Caleb did not smile. He kept his face neutral and his hands still. But something in the tension of the situation had shifted, and they all seemed to feel it. He waited another few minutes. Then, slowly, he reached into his pack and pulled out a strip of dried meat. He placed it on the ground in front of him and moved his hands back to his thighs. The green one was the first to creep forward. It sniffed the meat from 2 body lengths away, then looked at Caleb, then sniffed it again. It took the strip and retreated. One by one, each of them came forward. He had brought enough food for himself. He gave most of it to them that afternoon. Then he went back to the river and spent 2 hours hunting, caught enough small game to fill a pack, brought it back, and fed them again. By the time the sun dropped and the bioluminescent plants along the ravine walls began to glow soft blue and gold, all 5 of them were asleep in a pile around his legs. Caleb sat with his back against the cave wall and looked at the glowing forest above the ravine and thought that he would stay just the one night, make sure they were stable, and move on in the morning. In the morning, the gray one was sitting on his boot and refused to move. He stayed 3 more days before he even seriously considered leaving. 3 weeks passed before Caleb stopped counting the days. He had not planned to stay. He had told himself, on each of those first mornings, that today would be the day he would move back to the crash site and focus fully on the beacon repair and the business of being rescued. And then Thorn would do something reckless near a cliff edge, or Cinder would get his wings stuck between 2 rocks while trying to climb, or Ember would sneeze and set a bush on fire and then look at him with an expression of complete innocence, and the day would be gone before he noticed. He built a proper camp in the ravine. He reinforced the cave entrance against wind and rain. He built a low fire that gave warmth without drawing attention, and he kept it burning through the cold nights while 5 small dragons piled against him for heat, and he lay staring at the cave ceiling working through the situation with the calm, methodical thinking that his old job had trained into him. The situation was this: 5 hatchlings, no parent, no sign of a nest community anywhere nearby. Too young to hunt well. Too young to fly more than short distances without tiring. Not enough fat on any of them to survive a long cold stretch without food. Without help, their odds were poor. He was a wilderness survival trainer. Helping things survive was what he did. So he taught them. He taught Frost to track, not by talking, since words were useless between them, but by demonstrating. He would find a trail and follow it slowly, pointing out each mark, each broken stem, each change in the soil. Frost would watch with those pale, careful eyes, then follow behind him with its nose low to the ground, testing. Within a week, Frost could follow a track he could not even see. He worked with Ember on her fire. The problem was not that she could not produce flame. The problem was that she produced it in large enthusiastic bursts that tended to set everything nearby alight, including herself on 2 memorable occasions. He made a simple target from wet clay and river stones and taught her to aim, to hold back, to release in a controlled stream rather than an explosion. She hated the process. She was not built for patience. But she hated failing more, and slowly, the bursts became something closer to precision. Thorn was harder. Thorn had the particular energy of a creature that had never sat still long enough to realize that sitting still was an option. He led Caleb on 3 separate panicked searches through the forest in the first 2 weeks, having wandered off while Caleb was busy with one of the others. After the 3rd time, Caleb fashioned a simple bell from a piece of hull metal and attached it to a cord he tied around Thorn's neck. Thorn hated it. The sound gave away every ambush he tried to set up, ruined every surprise entrance, announced his arrival at all times. But he stopped disappearing. Sable mostly watched. She was the quietest of the 5, and the most careful, and she had a habit of appearing silently at Caleb's elbow when he was doing something that required focus, which should have been unnerving but was somehow not. He got used to it. He got used to all of them. And Cinder, large and clumsy and completely convinced that this time the wing would work properly, kept trying to fly. He would climb to the highest point he could reach, spread those broad gray wings, and launch himself into the air with full confidence. He would glide, almost gracefully, for a few seconds. Then something would go wrong, the angle would shift, the wings would tangle, and he would come down in a heap. He always got up. Caleb watched him do it 15 times in one afternoon and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to something that stubborn. Eventually he built a simple harness from cord and cloth scraps that gave Cinder's left wing a slight adjustment in angle. It was not pretty engineering. It worked. The forest around the ravine was not tame. It had predators, large ones, and the hatchlings were not yet big enough to be safe from the bigger ones alone. Caleb started carrying his blade openly after the first encounter with something he logged as a ridge stalker, a long, low creature with too many legs and a jaw that opened in 3 directions. He had driven it off with fire and noise, which had been enough. He noted that it preferred easier targets. The second encounter was different. It came at dusk, 3 weeks in, moving low through the trees toward the camp. It was larger than the first, wide across the shoulders, with a dragging, deliberate walk that said it was not looking for easier prey. It had seen them and decided they were the meal. Caleb stood between the camp and the creature, blade in hand, working through the angles in his mind. He had handled dangerous animals before. He knew how to read their movement. He was watching the creature's front legs for the shift in weight that would come before a charge. He did not get to find out if his plan would have worked. All 5 hatchlings came from behind him at the same time. It was not a coordinated attack in any military sense. Ember hit it from the right with a flame burst that caught its flank. Frost and Thorn came in low from either side, biting and clawing. Sable landed on its back and did something with her claws that made the creature twist in a way that suggested real pain. And Cinder, who had missed the timing and arrived half a second late, simply landed directly on top of it from above with his full weight, which was considerable. The creature left. Quickly. Caleb stood and watched it go, then looked at the 5 hatchlings who were now milling around his feet, buzzing with energy, all of them making sounds he had come to recognize as the dragon equivalent of talking over each other excitedly. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he sat down on the ground, which was something they seemed to understand as an invitation, and they all climbed on or around him in a wave of scales and warmth. He stayed that night with his back against the cave wall and 5 small dragons asleep across his lap, and thought about how long it had been since anything had fought for him without being asked. He stayed the next day too. And the day after that, something happened at the edge of the tree-line. He had been working on the beacon repair, laid out on the ground with the parts of the communication array spread around him, Frost watching from nearby. He heard it before he saw it. A sound so low it was less of a sound and more of a pressure, felt in the chest rather than heard by the ears. He looked up. The elder dragon stood at the edge of the forest. It was enormous. Caleb had seen large things in his life, but this was large in the way that mountains were large, the kind of large that made the scale of everything else feel suddenly different. Its scales were dark brown and gold, old and thick, and its eyes, fixed on Caleb with complete, unreadable attention, were amber and ancient and very, very awake. The 5 hatchlings behind Caleb went very still. Caleb set down his tools. He stood up slowly. Then he stepped forward, putting himself between the elder dragon and the hatchlings. He did not draw his blade. It would have been pointless. He stood with his hands at his sides, open, and he met those amber eyes and held them, because backing down was not something that made situations better, in his experience. The elder dragon looked at him. It looked at the camp. It looked at the 5 hatchlings, who were now pressed against Caleb's back in a cluster. It looked at Caleb again. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing between the trees without a sound. Caleb breathed out. That night, Frost pressed close against his side and projected a wordless impression, the elder dragon's face, and something that felt like familiarity, like the hatchlings knew him. And then another impression, the elder dragon's amber eyes, and something that felt to Caleb, in the particular way that things felt when Frost shared them, like he had been found acceptable. Caleb did not know what that meant yet. He would find out later. 2 days after that, the beacon sent a stronger pulse. Somewhere far away, a signal was picked up by a passing relay station. A flag appeared on a search and rescue database. Caleb did not know this either. He was busy teaching Thorn not to bite the bell on his own neck. The ruins were Ember's idea, in the way that anything was her idea, which was that she went there without asking and waited for everyone else to follow. Caleb had noticed her moving in that direction twice before, east through the deep forest where the trees grew older and the undergrowth thinned out into something that felt deliberate, like it had been cleared once a long time ago. The 3rd time she went, he followed. The others came behind him in their usual formation, Frost at his shoulder, Thorn circling wide and getting his bell caught on branches, Sable at his left heel, Cinder bringing up the rear with occasional wing adjustments that took him sideways off the path. The ruins opened up after a long walk, and they were not small. Stone structures rose from the forest floor, some crumbled to their foundations, some still standing with walls intact and roof beams long since rotted away. The whole place was covered in carved script, dense and layered, running up pillars and across archways and along the floors in patterns that felt purposeful. Whatever this place had been, it had mattered. Someone had put a great deal of care into making it last. Caleb moved through it slowly, recorder in hand, capturing everything. He did not have the language. He did not expect to find it. But documentation was a habit that did not require understanding, and what he recorded today someone else might be able to read one day. The hatchlings moved through the ruins differently than they moved through the forest. Quieter. Careful with where they placed their feet. Ember, who was never quiet, kept her wings folded and her steps measured. Even Thorn stopped trying to climb things for most of the visit. It felt to Caleb like the way people moved in places that were old and important, whether they understood why or not. They spent 3 days going back to the ruins. On the second day, Caleb found what looked like a learning hall, a wide open space with rows of low stone platforms arranged in a half-circle around a central carved column. The column was covered from base to top in detailed images cut deep into the stone: dragons in flight, dragons on the ground, dragons in groups and alone, and at the very top, something that looked like a family grouping, 5 young ones and 2 adults, carved with more care than anything else on the structure. He stood and looked at it for a long time. That evening, sitting near the campfire back at the ravine, Sable came and settled beside him. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the warmth that began at the edge of his mind, gentle and slow, like someone opening a door carefully so it would not make noise. He had felt this before, small impressions, brief flashes of image or feeling. But this was longer, more deliberate. What she showed him was a memory. Not hers. A storm. The same ion storm that had crashed his ship, he was almost certain, the same pressure and light and chaos. A much larger dragon, the mother, moving through the storm with the 5 hatchlings close behind her, trying to reach lower ground. A cliff. A sound like something breaking deep in the stone. And then the cliff face coming loose, a wall of rock and earth and debris, and the mother turning, not running, not fleeing, turning back toward the hatchlings with wings spread wide. The memory ended there. Not because nothing followed, but because Sable could not show him what she had not seen. The hatchlings had been knocked clear. They had found the cave. They had waited. The mother had not come. Caleb sat very still for a long time after Sable stopped. The storm that had taken the mother was the same storm that had taken everything he had: his ship, his signal, his quick path back to places where people knew his face. The connection sat in him strangely, not like coincidence, more like 2 threads tied together at a point he had not known existed. He went quiet the next day. And the day after that. He sat near the fire in the mornings, and did not go to the ruins, and did not work on the beacon, and did not do much of anything except think in the slow, circular way that grief moved when something struck it at an angle it was not expecting. The hatchlings did not try to fix it. He noticed that and was grateful for it in a way he could not have explained. They did not crowd him or make noise or drag him places. They simply stayed. Ember patrolled the camp perimeter with more energy than usual and kept the area clear without being asked. Frost sat near him and watched the surrounding forest with quiet attention. Thorn, whose natural state was motion, forced himself to slow down and spent most of both days within arm's reach, which was the most still Caleb had ever seen him. Cinder lay stretched out across his feet. Sable was at his side, not projecting anything, just present. It was the exact shape of something he had known once before. His younger sister, Lucy, had done the same thing after the accident. She would not ask questions or offer solutions. She would just appear next to him and stay there, as if being present was its own kind of answer. As if her being nearby meant that the silence had company, and company made the silence smaller. Lucy had been gone for 4 years. The accident had taken her too. He had not let himself think about her in a long time. There was a cost to thinking about her, a specific kind of pain that he had learned to step around carefully, the way you stepped around a loose board in a floor you knew well. He thought about her now. And then, because he was far from home on an alien planet with no working radio and 5 dragons who were depending on him and a grief that had been sitting in his chest for 4 years waiting for a moment like this one. He talked. Not to fix anything. Not because it would help the beacon or the survival plan or anything practical at all. He just talked. He told them about his parents, who had died when he was 19. He told them about Lucy, who was 6 years younger and had laughed at everything and had been the only person who could make him laugh too. He told them about the transport crash that had taken her, and the 2 years after it when he had taken every remote posting he could find, the more isolated the better, because being around people who were fine made the absence of someone who was not fine too loud to bear. The hatchlings did not understand the words. He knew that. But they listened with the focused, total attention that animals gave to things that mattered, and there was something in that kind of listening that words could not describe but the body recognized. When he stopped talking, the fire was low and the forest was dark, and he felt emptied out in the particular way that happened when something had been stored too long and was finally let go. Sable leaned against his arm. Slowly, carefully, she opened the door again in the gentle way she had. What she showed him this time was not a memory. It was something simpler. The 5 of them, around the fire, in the ravine. The stone walls glowing soft gold in the firelight. No storm anywhere in the image. No chaos. Just the camp, and the fire, and everyone in their places, and the night around them quiet and whole. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he put his arm around Sable's neck, and she pressed closer, and the fire burned down, and nobody moved. Dana Cole had been a xenobiologist for 11 years, and she thought she had seen most of the things that first contact situations could throw at a person. She had not seen this. The rescue ship landed in the clearing near the crash site on a bright morning, and the crew of 4 stepped out with their standard contact protocol kits and their emergency medical supplies and their expectations, which were 1 stranded human, possibly injured, probably disoriented, in need of immediate extraction. What they found instead was a man in good health, slightly more bearded than his file photo, standing in a wide open space that had been cleared and organized into a functional camp with mapped paths, stacked supplies, and documentation markers at regular intervals. He appeared to be in the middle of a focused activity involving a large flat-topped rock, a series of small clay targets, and a red dragon the size of a large dog who was producing controlled bursts of fire at specific targets while he watched and offered corrections through gestures. Dana stopped walking. The rest of her crew stopped behind her. The man looked up, saw the ship, saw them, and raised a hand in a calm wave. He said something to the red dragon, who looked over at the crew with an expression that Dana would later describe in her field notes as distinctly unimpressed. Then he walked over to meet them. His name was Caleb Monroe. They knew that from the file. What the file had not covered was the way he introduced the dragons before he said anything else, not as specimens or local wildlife, or even as a situation that required explanation, but the way a person introduced members of their household. This is Ember, she is cautious of strangers, do not approach her directly. This is Frost, who will probably approach you first, he is the curious one. The green one is Thorn, ignore the bell, he does not like it mentioned. The black one is Sable, she is shy but she understands more than she shows. And the gray one at the back is Cinder, who is friendly and will almost certainly walk into someone before the day is out. Dana looked at the 5 dragons who were now arranged in a loose half-circle behind Caleb, each of them watching the crew with careful attention. She looked at Caleb. He looked back at her with a particular calm of someone who had been doing something for long enough that it no longer seemed unusual to them. One of her crew, a man named Carl who had a habit of speaking before he finished thinking, said that they needed to move quickly and get the man to the ship for medical clearance and extraction. He said it loudly. Ember's scales bristled and she made a sound that was low and pointed and absolutely not directed at Caleb. Caleb turned to Carl and said, quietly, that it would be a good idea to lower his voice. Carl started to object. Frost stepped forward and sat down between Carl and Caleb, which was not an aggressive gesture but was very clearly a positional one. Carl lowered his voice. Dana pulled her recorder out and started taking notes. They spent the morning at the camp. Dana asked questions, and Caleb answered them with a thorough, practical detail of a man who had been keeping careful track of everything that happened. He showed her his documentation of the ruins, his behavioral notes on each of the hatchlings, his survival maps of the surrounding terrain. He told her about the elder dragon, who had appeared twice at the tree lean and had not been hostile. He told her about the mother, and the storm, and what Sable had shown him. Dana listened to all of it with the focused attention of someone whose job it was to understand things that had not been understood before. Then she said what she had come to say, which was that there were extraction protocols in place, quarantine requirements for anyone who had had extended contact with unclassified alien species, and that the crew was prepared to take him out today if he was ready. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was not leaving yet. Dana had expected this. She had read the situation on approach. She asked him why. He looked at the 5 hatchlings, who were sitting in a row behind him in a way that was either coincidental or the most deliberate thing she had ever seen, and he said that they were not ready to be on their own. He said it the way a person stated a fact, not the way a person made an excuse. Carl, who had not entirely learned his lesson, made a comment about alien attachment behaviors and recommended immediate separation for both the human's well-being and scientific integrity. He used his official voice for it, which was louder than his regular voice. All 5 hatchlings moved at the same time. They did not charge. They did not make threatening sounds. They positioned themselves, and that positioning was so precise and deliberate that the entire crew went quiet in the same breath. Frost was directly in front, facing the crew, sitting straight with the stillness of a creature that was not afraid and was not bluffing. Ember was to the right, flanking wide. Thorn was to the left. Cinder and Sable were behind Caleb, one on each side. The formation was small. It was 5 young dragons that none of them could have been fully afraid of in any practical sense. But it was completely, clearly, and without any ambiguity whatsoever a declaration. Dana looked at it for a long moment. She thought about every piece of xenobiological training she had received, every paper she had read on alien cognitive behavior, every first contact framework she had studied. None of it had a category for what she was looking at. What she was looking at was not instinct. Instinct did not hold formation. Instinct did not position a slower-moving individual at the protected center. Instinct did not choose. This was a choice. She put her hand on Carl's arm and told him to step back. She told the whole crew to step back. Carl started to argue. She told him again, in a tone that closed the argument. She looked at Caleb. She asked him how long the bond had been developing. He thought about it and said he did not think of it as a bond exactly. He said he had stayed one night to make sure they were stable, and then the gray one had sat on his boot, and things had gone from there. Dana made a note. Then she asked him, with a genuine curiosity that had made her good at her job, whether he wanted to leave. Caleb was quiet for longer than the question seemed to require. Then, at the edge of the tree lean, the elder dragon appeared. Varek. Caleb had started thinking of him as Varek, after a word Frost had impressed on him that seemed to be a name. The elder dragon stood at the edge of the trees and looked at the crew, and then at the camp, and then, with the deliberate attention of something very old and very certain, at Caleb. He made a sound. Low and slow, like a resonance rather than a voice. Caleb turned his head toward the sound the way a person turned toward something familiar. Dana wrote in her notes, "The human has been recognized. Not adopted. Recognized. There is a difference." Then she called the extraction coordinator on the ship and told them to hold the timeline. She had a proposal to put together. Dana Cole wrote her proposal on the ship that evening and sent it before she slept. It was not a long proposal. The most important things rarely were. She laid out what she had observed, what it meant under existing interstellar contact law, and what she believed should happen next. She attached Caleb's documentation of the ruins, his behavioral records, his terrain maps, and a 17-second clip from a recorder that showed Frost stepping between a member of her crew and Caleb without any cue from Caleb at all. The organization responded in 4 days. The answer was yes. A formal xenological study station would be established on the planet, which was logged in the system as Ethar. Caleb Monroe would serve as lead survival and field relations consultant, the first human to hold a formal role in direct ongoing contact with a sovereign alien species. The 5 hatchlings were classified under interstellar contact law as sovereign alien juveniles, which meant no removal, no containment, no interference. The bond was to be documented, not disrupted. Dana told Caleb the news at the camp in the morning. He listened to the whole thing without expression. When she finished, he nodded once, as if the outcome had been somewhere between expected and hoped for, and he was not sure which side it fell on. Ember, who had been sitting nearby, walked over and put one foot on Caleb's boot and left it there. Caleb looked down at her. Then he looked at Dana and said that sounded workable. Dana laughed. It was the first time she had laughed on that planet, and it surprised her. The weeks that followed were busy in the way that building something always was. Dana's crew stayed longer than planned. A second team arrived with equipment and supplies for the station construction. The ruins were formally documented and logged. Caleb trained the new crew in field safety protocols specific to Ethar, including a section on the hatchlings that he delivered with a kind of detail that made it clear he had been paying close attention for a long time. The hatchlings grew. It was gradual, but clear. They were bigger, stronger. The soft, rounded lines of very young creatures were sharpening into something more defined. Ember's precision with fire had reached the point where she could put a flame burst through a gap the width of a hand from 20 meters away. Frost had started ranging further from camp on scouting runs, and his returns were more informative. He had learned to lead Caleb to things worth seeing rather than simply walking back beside him. Thorn had lost the bell, eventually, after Caleb decided he had demonstrated enough reliability that the experiment had served its purpose. Thorn had celebrated by immediately staging 3 ambushes in the same afternoon, all of which Caleb had seen coming. Sable had begun extending her memory sharing to Dana. It had started small, a brief impression here, a passing image there, the kind of thing that could be explained as accidental. But Dana, who had learned quickly to be still and open when Sable was nearby, found herself receiving longer impressions over time, and recording them carefully in her notes with a growing certainty that she was not receiving random fragments but curated ones. Sable was choosing what to share. She was building something, slowly and deliberately, and Dana was beginning to understand that what she was building was trust. Cinder had become the best flyer of the 5. Nobody had seen it coming. He had crashed so consistently for so long that the working assumption around camp was that he would be the last to achieve reliable flight. And then one morning he had climbed to his usual height, spread his wings at the angle the harness had trained into him, and simply flown, smoothly and cleanly and without incident, out over the ravine and across the treeline and in a wide circle above the camp before coming back to land, correctly, in the open space near the fire. Everyone in camp had watched it happen. Cinder had landed, looked around at the watching faces, and then walked directly to Caleb and stood there expectantly. Caleb had put his hand on the gray head and said, quietly, that it was about time. Varric came to the camp regularly now. Not every day, but enough that the research crew had stopped going still when they heard his approach. He never entered the camp itself. He stood at the treeline, sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes for most of an afternoon, watching. Dana noted that he watched Caleb most often and longest. She noted also that Caleb always acknowledged his presence, a nod, a brief stillness, sometimes just a glance in that direction, and that Varric always seemed to register the acknowledgement in the particular way that old creatures registered things they had decided were correct. Then, 7 months after the rescue ship had first landed, a second thing arrived that Caleb had not expected. A transfer offer. It came through the official communication channel, formal and well-worded, from a prestigious research and exploration posting in the core systems. Higher classification, higher pay, recognition, the kind of career movement that the Caleb who had first taken remote postings to outrun his grief would have looked at and felt nothing about because it was all the same distance from everything he was running from. He read it at the camp table in the morning, while the station crew was still waking up and the hatchlings were doing what they did in the first hour of day, which was move through the camp in various states of alertness and interest. He read it twice, carefully, because it was well written and deserved the attention. Then he folded it and set it on the table. Ember walked over, sniffed it once, and sat on it. Caleb looked at her. She looked back at him with the total confidence of a creature who had weighed the situation and made a decision and did not see any reason to discuss it further. He did not move the paper. He picked up his coffee, which was not real coffee but a local plant that had a similar effect and a taste he had stopped noticing about 3 months in, and he drank it while the camp woke up around him. That evening he walked to the cliff east of the ruins, the wide one that looked out over the bioluminescent forest. He went there most evenings now when the light was right. The plants below lit up in blue and gold as the sun dropped, and the effect was something he had never been able to adequately describe in his recorder notes, though he had tried. All 5 of them came. They arranged themselves the way they always did in places that mattered, without being directed, without discussion, simply settling into the configuration that felt right. Frost sat beside him on the left, watching the horizon. Ember was on the right, wings half open, catching the warm air that rose from the lit forest below. Thorn was moving back and forth behind them, not restless exactly, more like a creature that expressed itself through motion and was expressing contentment. Cinder was lying down at their backs, large and warm, already drowsing. And Sable was beside Caleb's right hand, close enough that her scales pressed lightly against his arm. The forest glowed below them. The sky above went through its colors, the way alien skies did, taking longer than expected and producing shades that had no names yet in any language Caleb knew. Sable opened the door gently. What she showed him was not a memory and not a present image. It was something she had never shown him before. It was a forward-facing image, a possibility, not a certainty but a direction, the way a compass pointed. All of them, on this cliff, in this same arrangement, but older. The hatchlings larger, the lines of their scales more defined, the shapes of their faces settled into something fully grown. Caleb older too, with more years in his face, but there on the cliff, in his place, the same. And behind them, at the edge of the tree lean where the cliff met the forest, Verek's shape, watching. Still there. All of them. Still there. Caleb looked at the image for a long time. The bioluminescent forest moved below in the gentle wind and lit the undersides of the clouds in gold. He thought about the boy who had taken the loneliest postings he could find because the noise of people who were fine made the absence of people who were not fine unbearable. He thought about how long he had been moving away from things, and how at some point, without deciding to, he had stopped. He had not chosen this. He had stayed one night. The gray one had sat on his boot. Things had gone from there. He let the image settle in him the way it wanted to. Then he leaned back against Cinder's warm side, and Frost pressed closer on his left, and the sky above Ethar went dark and filled with stars, and the forest below them glowed in the particular way it did when the night was fully settled and everything that was supposed to be there was. At the tree lean, Verek watched. He had lived long enough to understand that the things which lasted were rarely the things that were planned. They were the things that happened one night at a time, small and unplanned, until one day you looked up and understood that what had been built was not made of stone or scale, but of something older and harder than either. He had no word for it in any language that had been spoken to him, but he recognized it when he saw it, the way old things recognized the things that were real. The fire burned down at the camp behind the cliff. Nobody moved to leave.